The first sound of winter came before the cold itself. It was the sound of grass hissing low against the prairie, the steady whisper of wind sliding across open land with nothing to stop it. Eli Harper heard it each morning when he stepped out of the wagon, boots sinking into frost-stiff earth. He would pause, listen, and measure the day by the way the air moved. Some mornings it rushed, others it pressed, slow and heavy, like a hand on his chest. Jonah, his younger brother, did not listen the same way. He felt instead. He rolled his shoulders, breathed deep, and said little. Where Eli counted and considered, Jonah lifted and carried. Together they had learned that work went best when neither tried to be the other. They had come to the edge of town in early autumn, when the light still lingered long, and the nights carried only a warning of cold. The land they claimed was plain and honest. No trees, no shelter, just grass worn thin by wind and a shallow dip where snow would someday gather. Most folks passed it without a second glance. "This is where it stands," Eli said, setting his heel into the dirt as if marking the ground with his weight. Jonah looked out across the empty sweep. "Wind will hit us clean from the north." "That's why," Eli replied. They had money enough for tools, a team, and lumber if they stretched thin. What they did not have was time. Winter did not wait for straight walls and careful joinery. Winter came when it pleased. The brothers planned in the evenings, sitting by a small cook fire, sketches spread on a crate between them. Eli's pencil moved slow, tracing circles where others would draw lines. "A cabin alone will bleed heat," he said. "Doesn't matter how tight we build it. The wind will strip it bare." Jonah nodded, sharpening a blade on a stone. "So we don't fight the wind." "No," Eli said. "We turn it." The idea was simple enough to sound foolish. A small cabin at the center. Around it, a ring of hay bales stacked tight and tall, not as walls but as weight. Feed and shelter in one. The circle would break the wind's teeth before it reached the wood. When Jonah heard it the first time, he smiled once and went back to sharpening. That was agreement enough. They began before the first hard frost. Jonah cut and fitted logs with clean strokes, raising the cabin low and compact. No wasted space, no high roof to catch the wind. Eli sealed every seam with care, packing gaps until the walls felt solid beneath his palms. The hay came next. Round bales hauled from a ranch 2 valleys south, each one heavy with summer sun. Rolling them into place took both brothers, ropes, leverage, and patience. They worked in rhythm, tip, roll, set, pack the gaps with loose hay until the wall felt whole. From town, it looked wrong. People stopped on the road to stare. Some laughed outright. Children pointed. Men shook their heads with the quiet certainty of those who had seen winters before. "They've built a nest for mice," someone said at the mercantile. "No roof on the hay," said another. Snow'll rot it clean through. A few were kinder. Old Mrs. Calder brought bread one afternoon and watched Jonah wrestle a bale into place. "You boys should have built a barn," she said softly. Eli wiped his hands on his coat. "Barns have corners." She didn't argue, but she did not stay long. The nickname came before the wall was finished. Hay Fort, Hay Ring. The children liked Hay Castle best, though there was nothing playful in the work. Each bale was set with intent, each gap filled. Eli walked the circle every evening, measuring with his steps, feeling the air change as he crossed from open ground into the quiet at the center. When the ring closed, the difference was immediate. Wind still moved above them, but inside the circle it softened, losing its edge. Jonah stood there one afternoon, hands on his hips, breath easy. "Feels like something's holding it back," he said. "That's the weight," Eli replied. "And the shape." They added a second layer on the north side, where winter would strike first. Higher, thicker. The work slowed as the days shortened. Their hands cracked. Their breath showed. By the time the first real cold arrived, the cabin stood ready, Smoke lifted straight from the chimney even when the wind screamed beyond the hay. Inside, the stove warmed the space with less wood than Eli had dared hope. They had one mule, a steady gray named Ash, who stood within the circle at night. His ears stayed forward. His sides did not tremble. That mattered. The first storm came early, riding a hard sky and a falling barometer. Snow did not drift against the hay the way it did against fences and sheds elsewhere. It slid, lifted, and passed on. By morning, the southern gap was still clear. In town, doors froze, roofs groaned. Men burned more wood and spoke less. Someone rode out on the second day, then another. They stood just outside the circle, stamping their feet, surprised by the calm. Eli answered questions without pride. Jonah said little, resting a hand on Ash's neck, feeling the steady warmth there. When the storm passed, the laughter did not return. It was replaced by silence, which felt heavier somehow. Winter had only begun, and the brothers knew the true test still waited ahead. The deeper winter announced itself without ceremony. One morning the sky stayed low and gray, and the cold settled in as if it had found a permanent seat. The wind no longer came and went. It remained, steady and unrelenting, pressing against the hay wall, day and night. Eli marked the change, not by the thermometer, but by sound. The prairie no longer hissed. It moaned. Inside the circle, the air stayed strangely composed, not warm, not gentle, but manageable. Jonah noticed it first while carrying an armful of split wood back to the cabin. Outside the ring, his coat snapped and tugged at his shoulders. Inside, it hung still against his back. He stopped, turned slowly, and walked back through the gap just to feel the difference again. Eli watched from the cabin door. "That's what corners do," he said. "They teach the wind where to bite." Jonah set the wood down, and circles teach it where not to. They settled into winter routines with little discussion. Each morning, Eli checked the hay wall, walking its length, pressing loose spots back into place. He packed snow where it helped seal gaps and cleared only what needed clearing. Jonah hauled water, split wood, and fed Ash, who had taken to standing near the cabin wall during the coldest hours, as if the wood itself offered reassurance. In town, the talk shifted. People still didn't praise the hay circle, but they asked about it. Quiet questions, careful ones. "How much wood you burning? How deep's the snow in there? Does the hay freeze?" Eli answered the same way each time. Calm, measured, no boasting. "The hay holds," he said, "as long as it's tight and used." One afternoon, when the wind climbed and the sky darkened early, a rider appeared at the southern gap. It was Thomas Calder, Mrs. Calder's eldest son. His horse's flanks were rimmed with ice, nostrils flaring wide. "Mind if I come in?" Thomas called. "Open gate," Jonah replied, already moving. Inside the circle, Thomas dismounted and stood still for a moment, surprise plain on his face. His shoulders dropped. His horse lowered its head. "It's quieter," he said. "That's the idea," Eli answered. Thomas stayed long enough to warm his hands by the cabin stove. He said little about why he'd come, but when he left, he looked back at the hay wall twice before riding away. The second storm came harder than the first. Snow fell thick and dry, driven nearly sideways. The wind howled without pause, a living thing throwing itself against anything that dared stand. Eli stayed awake through most of the night, listening. The hay wall groaned softly, not from strain but from weight settling. It held. By morning, the prairie beyond the circle had vanished beneath white waves. Fences were gone, landmarks erased. The road to town was nothing but guesswork. Inside the hay ring, the snow lay even and shallow. Ash stood calm, steam rising from his back. The cabin was cold at dawn, but it warmed quickly. The stove fed with care. On the second day of the storm, the shouting began. It carried faint at first, torn thin by the wind. Jonah heard it while breaking ice at the water barrel. He paused, listening, then cupped his hands. "Over here," came the reply. Closer now. Two figures emerged from the white, leaning into the gale. Marcus Hale and his brother Owen, men known in town for their fine timber barn and their certainty. Their coats were rimmed with frost. Marcus's beard was stiff with ice. Jonah opened the gate without a word. Inside, Marcus swore softly. "I'll be damned." Owen just shook his head, eyes moving from the hay wall to the cabin, to Ash, standing untroubled nearby. "Our roof's holding," Marcus said, voice tight, "but the north door's buried solid. We've been digging since before dawn." Eli poured hot water into tin cups and handed them over. "You can stay until the wind breaks." They stayed longer than that. By the third day, others came, one at a time. No crowds, no spectacle, just men and women worn down by cold and effort, stepping into the circle and feeling the difference settle into their bones. No one mocked now. They asked how high, how thick, how tight. Jonah showed them how to set a bale so it leaned just enough to resist push. Eli explained the gaps, the packing, the way snow could be used instead of fought. "It's not a wall," he said, again and again. "It's weight and shape." When the storm finally loosened its grip, the town emerged changed. Barns stood but bore scars. Drifts reached windows. Roof lines vanished beneath snow. The road reappeared only where many feet had worked it back into being. The hay circle stood much as it had before, heavier, settled, proven. That night, after the last visitor had gone and the gate was closed, Jonah sat on the cabin step, staring out at the moonlit wall of hay. "They won't laugh again," he said. Eli joined him, pulling his coat close. "That was never the point." Jonah nodded. Still, they sat in silence, the wind whispering above them, unable to find purchase. Far out on the prairie, winter gathered itself again, deeper and colder than before, and though the brothers did not say it aloud, they both understood. The hardest test had not yet come. The cold that followed was different. It did not rage. It endured. Days passed where the sun rose pale and weak, never lifting the frost from the ground. The wind slowed but thickened, pressing down instead of cutting across. Eli felt it in his joints when he woke. Jonah felt it in the weight of the axe before he swung. They worked less and watched more. Each morning, Eli walked the inner path between the hay wall and the cabin, listening to the sound under his boots. Packed snow meant stability. Hollow crunch meant trouble. When he found a soft place, he filled it with loose hay and stomped it down, then let the night freeze it solid again. The wall was no longer just stacked feed. It had become a single body, settling into itself. Jonah took on the harder tasks. When drifts formed outside the southern gap, he cut a channel through them with steady strokes, clearing just enough to keep access open. He never widened it more than necessary. "The wind learns," he said once. "Best not teach it more than it needs." Ash remained calm through it all. His gray coat thickened, his movements slow and economical. He had learned the shape of the circle, where to stand when the night grew sharpest, where the morning sun reached first. Sometimes Jonah swore the mule knew the weather before either brother did. The town struggled quietly. Smoke hung over rooftops day and night. Woodpiles shrank. Men who had once argued about methods now spoke only of endurance. When they came out to the hay circle, they came alone or in pairs, never together. Pride still lived, but it was thinner now, worn down by cold. One evening, Mrs. Calder arrived wrapped in layers, her steps careful. Jonah met her at the gate and took her arm. "I won't stay long," she said. "Just wanted to see." She stood inside the circle, eyes closed, breathing deep. "It's still," she said finally, "like the land's holding its breath." Eli nodded. "That's what keeps the heat." She opened her eyes. "My Thomas is building one come spring. Smaller, for the calves." "That'll work," Eli said. Just mind the gaps." Winter deepened into its longest stretch. The river froze thick enough to hold weight. The road vanished again and did not return. Supplies became precious. The brothers measured everything: wood, food, time. One night, the stove burned low before Jonah noticed. The cold crept in quiet and patient, settling into the corners of the cabin. Eli woke first, breath fogging thick. They fed the fire and sat wrapped in blankets until the warmth returned. "That was close," Jonah said. Eli nodded. Close is still enough. The storm that followed was the one people would speak of later. It began with silence. No wind, no snow, just a heavy sky and a pressure that made ears ache and thoughts feel slow. Eli watched the horizon all afternoon, uneasy. When the first flakes fell, they were large and soft, almost gentle. By nightfall, the wind returned. It did not scream. It pushed. The hay wall leaned into it, every bale pressed tight against the next. Snow struck and stuck, layer upon layer, sealing the outer face into a frozen shell. The circle grew heavier by the hour. Inside, the air remained slow-moving, but the cold pressed harder than before. Eli fed the stove more often, careful not to overdo it. Too much heat too fast could crack the iron. Jonah checked the wall twice in the night, his lantern throwing small circles of light against the hay and snow. At dawn, the storm showed its teeth. Snow fell so thick the world beyond the circle ceased to exist. Wind drove it low, rolling it along the ground like smoke. The sound was constant, a deep, endless rush. They stayed close that day. Jonah split wood inside the circle, movements tight and efficient. Eli wrote notes by the fire, observations he did not yet know would matter later. By the second night, the temperature dropped further than any before. The stove struggled. The cabin held, but only just. Frost crept along the inside edges of the window glass, tracing delicate lines. Ash stood near the wall, head lowered, breath steady but heavy. Eli stepped outside and felt the cold seize his lungs. It was not pain, it was absence. Heat vanished the moment it left the body. Inside the circle, the difference was measurable but narrow. The hay wall could slow the loss, not stop it. Eli understood that now with full clarity. This was the limit. Jonah met his eyes when he came back in. No words passed between them. They made adjustments. Jonah dragged 2 spare bales inward, breaking the perfect ring for the first time. They placed them along the north side of the cabin, creating a secondary barrier. Eli sealed the cabin door with an extra layer of cloth and waxed canvas. They moved the stove slightly, improving airflow. Small changes, earned ones. That night, the temperature inside held just above the line where breath stayed easy. In town, things were worse. The next morning, Marcus Hale arrived on foot, face drawn, eyes rimmed red. He did not speak at first. He just stood inside the circle, shoulders slumping. "Our youngest horse didn't make the night," he said finally, not accusing, just stating. Eli nodded once. He did not offer explanations. There was nothing to explain. Marcus stayed until midday, warming himself, helping Jonah clear snow from the inner path. When he left, he gripped Eli's arm hard. "You were right," he said, "about the shape." The storm broke on the 4th day, not with relief but with exhaustion. The wind slowed, then staggered, then fell away entirely. Snow stopped falling and simply lay where it had landed. The world emerged, changed again. Barns leaned, roofs sagged, woodpiles were gone or nearly so. People moved carefully, as if afraid the cold might return if startled. The hay circle stood scarred but whole. Snow coated the outer wall thick and smooth, an extra layer of armor. Inside, the ground was packed and navigable. The cabin door opened without digging. Word spread faster now. Not praise. Understanding. Men came to look, not to question. Women came to measure with their eyes. They traced the curve with slow steps, imagining their own land shaped differently. Eli answered when asked. Jonah demonstrated when needed. Neither spoke of the night the cold nearly won. As winter finally began to loosen its grip, the town no longer laughed, nor even whispered. They watched, instead, quietly filing away what they had seen. Spring would come, and when it did, the shape of the land would change in more ways than one. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in thin gestures. A longer line of light at dawn, snow that softened instead of cutting, water that began to move again beneath the ice with a low, patient sound. The brothers noticed these things without celebration. Winter was not done until it was done. The hay circle aged visibly as the days warmed. The outer snow shell cracked and slid away in heavy sheets, revealing hay darkened by moisture but still sound. The wall slumped slightly, settling into the ground it had protected all season. Eli welcomed the change. Movement meant release. Nothing that held forever stayed healthy. Jonah began peeling bales from the southern side, feeding ash, and stacking what remained usable for later. Each bale removed lightened the circle, opening it back toward the land. The wind slipped in again, gentle now, curious, rather than cruel. In town, men rebuilt. They shoveled collapsed drifts, reset fences, and counted losses. There was grief, but it was quiet. No one spoke of blame. Winter had done what it always did. It tested. When the ground thawed enough to take a post, the first new circle appeared 2 properties east, smaller than the brothers, built for calves. Then another near the river bend, wider, meant for 2 teams. Some used hay, others used straw. A few mixed both. They all curved. No one asked Eli or Jonah to oversee the work. They did not need to. The idea had already loosened from its makers. It belonged to the land now. One afternoon, Marcus Hale arrived again, this time with lumber stacked in his wagon. He stood beside the cabin, looking at it with something like respect. "I'm not tearing my barn down," he said, "but I'm adding to it." Eli nodded. "You'll want the curve facing north." "I know," Marcus said. He hesitated. "I lost 1 horse, but I won't lose another." They shook hands. It was enough. As spring deepened, the brothers turned to other work. The cabin needed repairs. The stovepipe was replaced. The ground inside the circle was leveled and seeded with hardy grass. By the time green began to show, the space no longer felt like a fort. It felt like a place that had been used. One evening, Jonah sat on the cabin step again, much as he had months before. The air was cool but forgiving. Ash grazed nearby, unbothered. "They'll remember this winter," Jonah said. "Yes," Eli replied. "For a while," Jonah added. Eli smiled faintly. "Long enough." The title the town gave it changed, slowly and without announcement. No one said Hayfort anymore. They called it the Ring, or simply the Circle. Children played near the old wall, tracing its shape with sticks. They did not know why it was there, only that it felt right. By summer, the last of the hay was gone, fed out or stored. The circle opened fully, leaving only a faint impression in the grass, darker and richer than the surrounding land. Eli walked it one final time, counting steps out of habit. "What now?" Jonah asked. Eli looked toward the open prairie, the road that led onward. "Now we decide whether to stay." They did. Years passed. The cabin weathered. The brothers aged. Ash grew slow and was replaced by another mule, then another. Each winter, the circle returned in some form, sometimes hay, sometimes straw. Once, packed earth reinforced with bales, the shape remained. Newcomers asked about it. Old-timers explained, not with equations or theories, but with stories. There was a winter, they would say, and 2 brothers, and a shape that held. No one mocked anymore. There was nothing left to mock. The land itself had answered. When Eli grew too stiff to walk the full circle, Jonah did it for him. When Jonah's shoulders no longer carried bales as easily, younger hands took their place. The knowledge passed without ceremony, like seed. One late autumn, long after the brothers had stopped measuring winters by storms. A boy stood at the edge of a new circle taking shape. He watched the bales roll into place, eyes bright. "Why round?" he asked. An older man, not Eli and not Jonah, but someone who had learned from watching them, answered simply, "Because winter doesn't like being told where to go, but it listens to shape." The boy nodded, as if that made perfect sense. Far off, the wind moved across the prairie, steady and inevitable, and when it came again in force, as it always would, it found no sharp corners waiting, only curves,